On the morning of January 3rd, news broke that Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and his wife Celia Flores were captured by the United States and were being transported to New York to stand trial for narco-terrorism charges. The world gasped. Some were frightened and some rejoiced. Many are asking, what will happen to Maduro? For me, the real question is, what will happen to Venezuela? And how does a country with more oil than Saudi Arabia, more proven reserves than any nation on earth, end up with mass migration and an economy reduced to barter and survival? Welcome to Sometimes and Forever with me, Denny Downing. Today's show is a departure from our usual conversations. Today we're talking about what is happening in our neighboring country, Venezuela. There are countries here in the Caribbean right now that are being affected by what is happening in Venezuela. Some airlines have cancelled flights to neighboring countries, disrupting travel to the Caribbean. Many are starting to watch their borders closely for the Venezuelans who may become refugees. So today we're asking, what happened to you, Venezuela? How did you come to this? This episode is not about one man alone. It's about the long road that led up to this moment. Because this tragedy didn't begin with Maduro. It began years, decades before him. To understand Venezuela today, we have to go back, way back to the oil, to the promises, and to the decisions made decades ago when the country believed it was untouchable. There was a time when Venezuela was the envy of Latin America. It was a country where highways gleamed and the middle class grew quickly. Oil money paid for schools, hospitals, and dreams of a modern future. In the 1950s and 60s, Venezuelans traveled freely. They sent their children abroad, and it was so easy to believe that their country was destined for greatness. Fast forward to today, where millions have fled the country. They're not going on a holiday. They're not going abroad to study. They're running away from the harsh realities of modern-day Venezuela. Grocery stores may have food, but for the most part, it's unaffordable. Hyperinflation and high prices mean that the average Venezuelan can't afford basic foodstuffs. Professionals like doctors and teachers earn so little that they have to work several jobs or flee the country altogether to provide for their families. This is not a simple story. It's not just about socialism or corruption or sanctions, although all of those matter. It's a story about dependence, power, populism, and promises made too easily. This is a story of what happened to Venezuela. Venezuela's fate changed forever in 1914 when oil was discovered in Mena Grande. By the 1920s, Venezuela was one of the world's largest oil producers. By the 1950s, it had become the richest country per capita in Latin America because oil transformed everything. Foreign companies, mostly American and European, poured in droves. Cities modernized quickly. Caracas became known as the Miami of South America. Venezuela had highways before many European nations that were rebuilding after World War II. But the very thing that made Venezuela rich proved to be its downfall. Venezuela's economy was almost entirely built on oil. Instead of investing heavily in agriculture or manufacturing or just diversifying its industries, oil money paid for imports. Food came from abroad, mostly. Consumer goods came from abroad. Even basic supplies were imported. And it was the oil that paid for everything. And when oil pays for everything, the country never learns how to survive without it. After decades of dictatorship, Venezuela transitioned to democracy in 1958. And for a time, it worked. Two major parties rotated power. Oil revenues funded social programs. The middle class expanded. But behind the social scenes, and this is the important thing to remember, behind the scenes, corruption grew quietly. Oil money made politics easy. because leaders didn't need to tax citizens heavily, which meant citizens didn't demand accountability. Governments could spend freely, often wastefully, without building strong institutions. Have you ever heard the term prepare for a rainy day? Well, Venezuela never did that. Perhaps they never thought the rain would ever fall. In 1976, Venezuela nationalized its oil industry, creating Petróleos de Venezuela S.A., or PDVSA for short. This became the state-owned oil and gas company of Venezuela, responsible for the country's vast energy resources. Privately owned oil companies became state-owned affiliates. Now, the government had a foot in on private companies, and the thinking was that the ordinary people would have a share of the profits. At first, this seemed like a triumph for sovereignty. Venezuela was finally exploring, producing, refining, and exporting its own oil. But it also meant that the country's economic lifeline was in the hands of the ruling few. When oil prices were high, Venezuelans felt rich. When oil prices fell, as they inevitably do, the cracks began to show. In the 1970s, Venezuela had borrowed heavily against the sale of oil to undertake some of its state-owned operations and carry out social spending. Well, by the mid-1980s, the price of oil fell. There was a glut on the market. Venezuela no longer had the money it once did to pay its loans. The debt ballooned, inflation rose, and so did poverty. And then yet again, everything changed. In 1989, the country entered the International Monetary Fund's austerity program after years of overspending. Prices for everything rose overnight. Transportation costs doubled and food became very expensive. The result was El Caracozo, or the Caracas Smash, which were mass protests and riots that left hundreds dead after a brutal military crackdown. For many Venezuelans, faith in democracy was shattered. They felt betrayed by the elites who had grown rich while ordinary people suffered. Into that anger stepped a man in a red beret, Hugo Chavez. Hugo Chavez was a former military officer who attempted a failed coup in 1992. His voice was loud and strong, and he quickly became a symbol of rebellion against a system that was keeping a boot on the necks of ordinary Venezuelans. By 1998, Chavez was elected president. He promised that he was going to end corruption, return oil to the poor, challenge foreign influence, and build a more equal society. And for a time, it seemed to work. Chavez got a big boost in the early 2000s when oil prices began to soar once again. He used oil money to fund massive social programs. There was free healthcare, free education, food subsidies, and housing. Poverty dropped, literacy improved, and many poor Venezuelans felt seen for the first time. But once again, the country made the same mistake. Everything depended on oil. Power was in the hands of the few, and corruption settled even deeper into the fabric of the country. Now that he was the ruler, Chavez moved to consolidate his power. He weakened independent institutions, packed the courts with his people, and controlled the media. There was a program called Allo Presidente, or Hello Mr. President. It began on the radio but expanded to television. This was a program where the people could call in and talk directly to the president. It was a win for Chavez. It was his way to push his Bolivarian agenda. Chavez also politicized the military, meaning he allowed army personnel to basically manage the country. PDVSA, the oil company, which was once a professional technocratic oil company, was purged of the experienced staff and filled with Chavez loyalists. Price controls were introduced. Currency controls followed. And if you know anything about economics, you will know that price controls never work because companies can't make a profit that way. So this caused imports to slow and the shortages began again. But as long as oil prices were high, The ruling class didn't have to worry much, but then it got worse. The government expropriated the oil companies that were still operating in the country. Many of these companies left the country altogether, and they decided to fight the government of Venezuela in the courts. So even though the courts ruled in the favor of the oil companies, and they said that Venezuela is supposed to pay back the oil companies for what the government expropriated, the Venezuelan government largely ignored the court rulings. The US government placed sanctions on Venezuela because there are a lot of US companies in Venezuela that suffered because of the expropriation. So this means that Venezuela was now unable to sell their oil abroad, but mostly to US allied countries. No worries, they sold oil anyway, because they sold oil to other countries that didn't care about the US sanctions. But we all know that nothing lasts forever, right? In March of 2013, after nearly 2 years of illness, Hugo Chavez died from cancer. His successor, Nicolas Maduro, inherited a broken system, which by all accounts he didn't try to fix. Oil prices collapsed globally. Without oil revenue, social programs collapsed, imports stopped, inflation exploded, and the government did what governments usually do in these moments. They printed money to survive. Hyperinflation followed, and it became so severe that salaries became worthless within days. Hospitals lacked medicine, electricity grids failed, water systems broke down, and millions left the country. Now here's one thing that a lot of people aren't talking about: the mass exodus of Venezuelans to other countries. There are some estimates that over 8 million people have left, some put it at 9 million people. If this is so, this means that this is the largest displacement of people in the Western Hemisphere. Think about that. What we're witnessing in Venezuela, ladies and gentlemen, is not a sudden disaster. It was, in fact, a slow motion collapse, decades in the making. Now, you remember we said at the beginning that Maduro is being charged as a narco-terrorist? So the question now is, how did he go from being a corrupt and inept leader of an oil-rich country to being a narco-terrorist? Well, there are allegations, and these are allegations. There are allegations, though, that the Venezuelan government was actually running a drug cartel. This cartel seems to have begun under Chavez, and it was continued in earnest by Maduro. That is why oil production was never a top priority for the country. The oil companies that were owned by the government were never modernized, and the oil infrastructure is what it was since the 1970s. Today, many people are talking about the capture of Maduro. They're asking, is it legal? Who's going to run the country? But the real question is, what is going to happen to the people of Venezuela? The reality on the ground is that there are parents who are skipping meals so their children can eat. There are doctors working without supplies, teachers who are barely earning a salary. And do not forget the thousands of families that have been separated by migration. These are nervous times for Venezuela and the region at large. But it's not all doom and gloom. With the right systems in place, the country can rise. It is, after all, a wealthy country, extraordinarily wealthy. But wealth without accountability breeds corruption. And oil, for all its power, is a dangerous foundation for a nation to build on. Venezuela's story is not just about socialism or capitalism. It's about what happens when leaders spend tomorrow's wealth today. When institutions are weakened in the name of loyalty, when a country forgets that prosperity must be built, not extracted. Venezuela will rise. It has all it needs to be the powerhouse it once was. Sometimes and forever, Venezuela will stand as a warning that natural resources and riches do not guarantee a good future. Only strong institutions, diversification, and leaders with integrity do. I'm wishing all the very best for Venezuela And I do hope that they will come out of this struggle very quickly and on solid ground. If you enjoyed today's episode, please go ahead and subscribe to the channel if you have not yet done so. Share it with somebody who you think might enjoy this conversation, and do leave me a comment below. Thank you. All the best.